inviting me here tonight. I'm a first-timer to this group. This is my first meeting, and I've just been amazed at the expertise and enthusiasm and generosity of the woodturners that I've met so far at workshops and demonstrations. And tonight, I'm really eager to share my realm with all of you of forest ecology and forest conservation. My origin story with turning was in Monteverde, Costa Rica, where I carry out my field research. I worked in the woodshop of Howard Rockwell, who was my 92-year-old neighbor. He generously allowed me to join him in his workshop and to start turning on his lathe, which was built in 1930. I made some little bowls to start out with. They were very simple. I hate to say that I used scrapers to make these, but I so loved the wood, the feel, and just the wonder of turning trees into bowls that I wanted more. And so last summer, I joined an amazing wood turning cruise in Norway. It piloted and plied the coastal fjords of Norway. There were 7 lathes on board. We had a number of spectacular demonstrators and professional turners, and the interactions with the other turners on that amazing crew was really fantastic and pushed me further into this world of wood turning. And one of those passengers was Tom Worsing, who served on the AAW Board of Directors for 6 years, 2 terms as president. He makes these amazing platters from big leaf maple trees. And those encounters on the ship, and also the encounters that I've had just these last couple of days, has made me understand that wood turners know and respect and love trees just as I do. And I think that that knowledge and respect and love for trees is so needed now as we face the threats that trees and forests are feeling these days in our current times. These threats are very complex. Human activities like clearing forest land to make pastures and the increasing frequency and severity of forest fires that we see on the news affect not only those who are local to those faraway places, but they also affect us here in Portland and and also in the hometowns of wherever you live, because of the interconnectedness of our planet. Because after all, we live within a tapestry of life, like this little poem by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote, "The tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever joining and breaking." And because of that very interconnectedness, we are now balancing, I think, on a ridge between hope and despair. And I think if we lean too far on the side of despair, we become immobilized. We can't do anything. But if we fall too much on the side of hope, we think, oh, well, somebody else is going to take care of it. And so all of this thinking about tapestry and interconnectedness of trees and bowls have made me think about how to weave wood turning into the tapestry of care and understanding for our forests, and the gifts that they give us, the wood that they give us to carry out our art and our craft. So tonight, I'd like to speak about 3 things. First, I'd like to share a little bit about what I've learned about the tapestry of the forest canopy, which I've been studying for the last 40 years. Secondly, I'd like to talk to you and share what I've been doing to try to weave nature and people together. And finally, I'd like to talk about some ideas about turners as tree ambassadors. But before I go into these 3 things, I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. I was the 3rd child of a large family, kind of chaotic, in Bethesda, Maryland, and I found myself finding joy and a sense of refuge by climbing the 8 maple trees that line my parents' driveway. And I remember as a little 8-year-old, I took this oath and I said to myself, when I turn out to be a grown-up, I want to do something that's going to protect trees. I didn't know exactly what that would be, but I decided eventually to pursue the thread of science and pursue a degree in forest ecology. As a way of knowing, as a PhD student, I chose to study the forest canopy, which at that time was almost completely unknown. In fact, it was called the last biotic frontier. And that was because there was really no way of getting access up there safely and non-destructively. But over the last 40 years, canopy researchers like myself and my colleagues and my students have developed ways to get up into the forest canopy with canopy walkways, with hot air balloons, with construction cranes, with drones and remote sensing. But the way I tend to use to get up into the forest canopy is using mountain climbing techniques to get up there. And I wish I could put you in the harnesses and ropes that my students and I use to get up there, but I'll do the next best thing, which is to show you a short clip of getting up into the forest canopy from a National Geographic television show called Heroes of the High Frontier. We leave that dark forest floor, the windless forest floor, the dark forest floor, to get up into the forest canopy where light is much more abundant. As you climb, you see that the structure of the forest looks very different. You really see the forest as a volume of three-dimensional space. And now that we have these techniques to get up there, we can focus on the biota that live up there and the complex interactions of the plants and animals that make this arboreal world their home. And it made me realize that the canopy itself is a tapestry, something that's connected, that's complex, that's strong, that's useful, and beautiful. So wondering how many of you would like to come with me to my next field session? All right, I was hoping. In any case, when you're up there with me in the forest canopy, you'll see that there's a tremendous diversity of biota, of animals that live in the forest canopy that lead part of their lives or their entire life cycles up there high above the forest floor with adaptations to hold on to those branches and leaves. And you can see that there are monkeys and sloths and birds and snakes, and I had to include that little ant there, which is an arboreal ant, because my husband, Jack Longino, is also a biologist. In fact, he's an ant taxonomist. His work is to classify and name ants, and when he proposed to me, he said that he would name an ant after me, and he did, Procrocopterus Nalini. And we've had 2 kids, and he's named ants after them also. So we are maybe the only family that has each of us members having an ant named after ourselves. However, it's actually the canopy plants, the plants that live in the forest canopy, called the epiphytes, that intrigued me the most as a scientist. They get their support, but not their nutrients from the host trees that support them, but rather they get their water and their nutrients that are dissolved in rainfall and mist that they encounter. Now, historically, these epiphytes have been considered a fairly minor part of the forest ecosystem. But over the 40 years that my students and I have been doing research, we have found that, in fact, they play very important, in fact, critical ecological roles in the forest as a whole. They provide a tremendous amount of food and resources and nesting materials for birds and arboreal mammals. And we know that in tropical forests, where nutrients are limited, nutrient inputs from outside the ecosystem are very important. So these epiphytes that get their nutrients from rain hold on to them for some time, and then transfer them to the forest floor when they die, make them act as nutrient sponges. And thus, really, these canopy-dwelling plants are keystone elements in these forests. But as of about 20 years ago, forest ecologists like myself have become aware that many human activities are having very negative impacts and effects on these incredible primary forest ecosystems. Climate change, forest fragmentation, deforestation, invasive plants, isolation of trees and pastures are all having very negative effects on these organisms. And at the same time, we've been seeing increasing isolation between humans and nature, as we've seen increasing urbanization and more virtual experiences with the world than real ones. And so, about 20 years ago, I as a scientist and I as a person realized that I needed to go beyond just publishing my little scientific papers about forest canopies, and I needed to do something that might raise awareness in the world of forests and trees and their importance to people and the need to protect those trees and forests. In a way, I really felt that I needed to fulfill that childhood oath that I took as a little kid. So I began and sort of realized that my deep connection to trees happened when I was a little girl and when I was climbing trees in my parents' backyard. But a little girl growing up in New York City or Tokyo or Nairobi does not have that opportunity of climbing trees that I did. And so I had to think of something that little girls treasure, that they value, that I could associate with trees. And I realized that Barbie might be the answer, because just about every little girl does love Barbie. And so I approached Mattel about making a treetop Barbie that might inspire little girls to become treetop biologists. For some reason, they were not interested in this. And so my students and I said, well, what the heck, we'll do it ourselves. We went to Goodwill, we bought used Barbies, we involved volunteer seamstresses to make her field clothes, we bought little helmets on eBay, we came up with We did try grant support again, but that was not amazingly, 15 years later in 2021, Mattel and National Geographic partnered to make a set of Explorer Barbies. They asked me to be an advisor since this was sort of my idea, and as a thank you, they made a one-of-a-kind Nalini look-alike treetop Barbie, which was in any case, that made me think back to this tapestry idea of weaving together the ecological values and the vertical lines that you see here that I discovered as the epiphytes and forest canopies being important and fundamental as ecological values, but trying to weave in other sectors of society to take an interest and be aware of the importance of these trees. For example, the recreational values of Barbie could be woven in as a horizontal thread into this tapestry. And so the second part of the talk, what I'd like to discuss with you is thinking about how spiritual values and social justice values and aesthetic values might also be woven in to create this tapestry of care and understanding of trees and forests. So let's think about how we could weave in spiritual and religious values into this tapestry. Well, my approach to this was to try to avoid the conflict that often comes up when science and religion try to mix. And so what I decided to do was, instead of relying on my scientific authorities as values, rather to draw upon spiritual and religious authorities. So I downloaded holy scriptures of all the world religions. I searched for the words trees and forests in them. Since followers of that faith already believe in those holy scriptures, I found, for example, in the Old Testament, there are 328 references to trees and forests. And all of those are verses that are something positive. That is food and shelter, they are temple adornments, they are location markers, and they serve as analogies to God. So I started putting together this data, so to speak. I combined this information into a sermon, and I delivered that sermon from the pulpits and bimas of places of worship of many, many different faiths. And there was never a conflict because I had drawn upon the religious authorities of the people themselves. My students and I then went on to map trees in churchyards, since churchyard soils should also be sacred, and the trees that grow in those sacred soils should also be sacred, and we created small booklets with the tree species and scriptural and scientific information about the tree species that grow in those churchyards. That led to doing tree plantings on seminary grounds and churchyards, and a real weaving together of the values, religious values and scientific values of trees for people of faith. Another sector that I've tried to engage is really drawing upon social justice factors and social justice values, and that is the world of incarceration. In our country, there are over 2 million adults and over 50,000 youth who are incarcerated. These are places where there is very little access to scientific information, science education, and they are also places that are almost devoid of any nature at all. So in 2004, I started collaborating with state prison systems to bring science education and nature to prisons in Washington, in Utah, and a number of other states around the country. We recruit scientists like myself to give lectures on research, on nature, and these have been very well received with curiosity and true wonder. That has led to participation and collaborations with state and private conservation groups that have trained the men and women inside prisons to rear endangered species like the Oregon spotted frog, the Taylor checker spot butterfly. They've been rearing 17 species of prairie plants that are then outplanted to protected areas. They've been building nesting boxes for the American kestrel, a bird that is declining in population across the USA. Our formal evaluations of the inmates showed that they increased their science knowledge content, and they also shifted their self-identity as science learners. Perhaps most important, they felt a sense of contribution, a sense of capacity to contribute to something bigger than themselves, bigger than the prison system, something as big as planet Earth itself. Now, we understand that these small programs don't erase the embedded injustices in our mass incarceration system, but these projects have brought to light some light to the darkest parts of imprisonment. And I also think that it recognizes the tremendous power of nature on the nature of humans. Well, what about aesthetic values? How do we weave aesthetic values into this tapestry of care and understanding of forests? One of the things I've done are create what I call canopy confluences, in which I invite a number of forest ecologists, as well as poets, creative writers, visual artists, and rap singers together for a week at a time. I teach them how to climb trees, and they spend days at a time up on small platforms in the canopy to create their art, their music, their poetry, their moss collections. One extension was the rap singer, where there was so much interest in the rap songs that he created in the canopy that we started a program called Sound Science to involve urban youth with nature. And I realized this is because, I as a frumpy kind of middle-aged professor, it is not of much use to inspire urban youth. So I engaged a professional rap singer named Caution to come to our campus. We brought together 40 at-risk youth from Tacoma, Washington. Caution, the rap singer, and I and other biologists spent time with them in the morning, and then in the afternoons we adjourned to our sound studios, and the students themselves created rap songs about their encounters with nature. They cut a CD, which they could bring to their friends and family, in their form of expression of rap music and hip-hop music and spoken word poetry. Well, another application of aesthetic values, I think, is fashion, which is valued by many, many people. In fact, it's a $1.7 trillion industry. And so I began thinking about ways that we could harness the glamour and appeal of fashion with awareness of trees and nature. Now, it's kind of funny for an ecologist like me to talk about fashion, because this is what my colleagues and I look like when we go out to the field. This was my first attempt. It's a moss cape that I made from the mosses of the Olympic Peninsula. It was really wonderful to wear, but after a while it began shedding, and it actually started growing and got too heavy for me to wear to parties. And so this is my new approach, which is to take images of real-life canopy biota, print botanically correct images of those plants on clothing, make them into garments, and then come with a hang tag that describes the biology and conservation of the species. And I decided to wear that little jacket tonight. So that really everyone who wears these garments then becomes a walking educator, a walking inspirer, a walking raiser of awareness of the importance of trees in our lives. So, with all of this put together, then we can see that it's been relatively easy to weave together these values that are quite different, but do intersect with the ecological values of trees and nature. And so what I'd like to think about now with all of you is to think about how woodturners might be part of this tapestry. After all, we all value trees because they provide the wood that we use. They provide aesthetic values and recreational values and economic values in some cases. I know that many of you are aware of the need for conservation of trees and actively work already to upcycle wood, for instance, that's created by city arborists, and to use scrap wood pieces for your projects. But I'd like to sort of turn this a little bit geographically and focus on my area of expertise, which is on tropical trees. We're very aware of the threats to tropical forests and the availability of tropical woods to turn, that in many cases, because of the threats to these trees and forests, that capacity to use tropical woods is limited. I'm sure many of you have heard of CITES. In 1975, that we established the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. This is a global treaty that has been signed by 183 nations to ensure that international trade of wild plants and animals is legal, traceable, and biologically sustainable. Now, this doesn't prevent the flow of wood, but it does provide different levels of oversight and care in trade of those woods at 3 different levels. For example, the tree bocote is not listed by CITES at all and is freely available. Spanish cedar is Appendix 3, so it's a little bit restricted, but not totally. Cocobola, which many of you use and love, is a level 2, and Brazilian rosewood is on Appendix 1, so it's extremely restricted. But like to talk about is a particular focus on one tree, the Pernambuco tree, also called pau-brasil. This is the national tree of Brazil. Actually, Brazil is the only country that is named after a tree, and it is this tree that it's named after. It's in the legume family. It has dense orange-red heartwood, and historically it's been very important by providing a red dye. It's a premier wood for bow making, for cellos and violins, and it's on CITES Appendix 2. So permits are required, and it needs this protection because it is dependent on old-growth primary forest, the conditions that we find in old-growth forest. It cannot be grown in plantations. It grows only in these Atlantic forests of Brazil, which was once widespread historically. Right now, currently, about 70% of the population of Brazil depends on these forests. There are 20,000 species of plants and animals and fungi, 29 different ethnic groups that live in these forests, but it is a habitat in crisis. Due to deforestation, human development, it is now reduced to just very, very small fragments. Only 12% of the original widespreadness exists at this time. Well, in thinking about connecting, turning with tropical trees, I learned about an amazing organization called RAIN, Regenerative Agroforestry Impact Network. The vision of this conservation group is that people on the front line of ecological crises will be empowered to regenerate their local ecosystems. It's an amazing group, and in honor of the work that they do and to spread the word of what they're doing, I brought the founder and co-director of that group here to this meeting today, Danny Diskin. He's sitting right here at the front table. And just to give you a little background, RAIN has community-centric projects, nature-based solution, and has forged strategic partnerships with an emphasis on indigenous ways of knowing with groups such as the Pataxó. But I have to say, the program that has intrigued me most about this group is what they call Trees of Music. They promote biodiversity and ecosystem resilience of these very Atlantic forests with musicians through connections and collaborations with musicians, because musicians want to continue to have their bows for their violins and cellos. And so they have collaborations with musicians, with environmentalists, and with traditional Brazilian communities. They collaborate with musicians, with music schools, and music-related companies. And that made me think about us and about the AAW, that us woodturners who, like musicians, use and love their instruments, we use and love trees and the wood they provide for our craft and our art, so we could become ambassadors as well. Well, how might we become ambassadors for trees? Well, we already communicate with lots of people through our demonstrations, our shows, and training workshops and schools. We might engage those people that love our work by raising their awareness through conversations and exchange of information. We can use media as well. We might engage journalists to write articles, or write articles ourselves about our wood turning and its connection to tropical trees. We might engage other woodworking magazines, and any magazines or journals that concern forests or trees. We might use local media. For example, last year I approached my local NPR station to host a weekly 2-minute program called Keynote, which is a simple little explication of some aspect of trees and the wonder of trees and our human relationship with trees. Many of you have YouTube channels and YouTube shows, and so perhaps your followers can be apprised of the importance and connection of trees to your art. We are members of local woodturning groups who regularly do fundraisers for people in need, so we might fundraise for a program such as RAIN's project. Perhaps future AAW field trips to the tropics, to Brazil, to visit and experience in person these Atlantic forests, the tropical trees that we use, and the people who are responsible for caring of them. Well, these are big things, these ideas to sort of carry out projects to create programs and sustain the engagement that might be needed to make a difference in terms of sustaining tropical forests. But I want to emphasize that small is good also. Small actions that we do collectively can have a big effect. For example, I suggest if you're flying home, you do what I do on an airplane. First, open your laptop and put some slides up of either a tropical forest or perhaps some of the work that you do with wood turning. And then slowly shift your laptop slightly to the right. And suddenly you'll have this fantastic conversation with the person next to you for the rest of the airplane trip. And in fact, I did some math. There are 325 million people in this country. There are 6.2 million scientists and conservationists in the United States. And if each one of us has a conversation about trees and forests with just 52 people a year, that's one person a week, we will have reached every single person in this country. So the next time you get a latte, tell the barista about shade-grown coffee. The next time you go in an Uber, talk to the driver about electrical vehicles, and you will have done your job in terms of spreading the word about trees and forests and ecology. We can think about what AAW might do collectively. I had a wonderful encounter with the Turners Without Borders this afternoon, and I see that there are already actions that are being taken by the AAW to promote connections and engagement with people in other places. Perhaps we can use the network of the AAW for communication in the future. Now, I'm a newbie here. As I said, this is my first meeting, so I don't really know what the capacity of this group is to do it or what shape and form such kinds of activities might take. But I really urge you to think about that, to talk to your table mates, to talk to the people in your shop, to exchange ideas about what we might do. And if you have some ideas, please feel free to contact me or Danny with the ideas that you might come up with.